All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Dunk on AP podcast. Today we are talking about Unit 6. We made it to Unit 6. We're still in the year 1750 to 1900, but what we're doing now is rather than talking about just the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, this unit really is about the effects of that, especially the effects of the Industrial Revolution. And one of the major effects is imperialism. And so today, with topic 6.1, to start off, we're going to be talking about rationales for imperialism. So, with all that in mind, let's go ahead and go dunk on AP. So, I guess we should go ahead and start with defining what is imperialism. So, imperialism is the exertion of influence over other countries, especially by means of expansion. This practice involves the use of both hard power, such as military and economic strength, as well as soft power, which includes the diplomatic influence and cultural dominance of a country over a smaller country or a country that isn't as powerful. So, the primary objective of imperialism is to establish or sustain dominance over another country. So, moving from colonialism into imperialism, and that doesn't mean colonialism is going to stop altogether, but you are going to see less of a move from a place going and setting up a place like Britain going and setting up colonies into really more exerting influence through the use of troops and business and stuff like that. So, 1494, you get the Treaty of Tordesillas, which of course splits the world between Spain and Portugal. Now, moving forward from that, in the 1500s and 1600s, you get the establishment of Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas. And in 1607, you get the founding of Jamestown by Great Britain. Now, and then in the 1600s to 1700s, you get the expansion of European colonialism in Asia and Africa. Then in the closer to present day, there are overseas territories like Puerto Rico and the Falkland Islands for the UK. And Puerto Rico belongs to the US as a territory. So, continuing sort of this idea of the transition from colonialism into imperialism, because that was what we were just talking about was colonialism. So in the late 18th century, which remember is the late 1700s, the Industrial Revolution begins in Britain, and that fuels the need for raw materials and markets. So in 1839 to 1842, you get the first Opium War between the Qing dynasty and Britain, and then in 1853 to 1854, you get the Perry expeditions to Japan to force open Japanese markets. Then in 1884 to 1914, you get the scramble for Africa. 1948, which I know we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, the Marshall Plan allows the U.S. to exert influence on post-World War II Western Europe. Now, Britain really fits into the category of colony and imperial power, but we'll talk a lot about Britain today. So the rationales for imperialism in 1750 to 1900, various rationales were used by imperial powers to justify their imperialistic actions. So these justifications were a mix of economic, political, cultural, and ideological reasons. So the four reasons that we're going to get to, the first is social Darwinism. And then looking ahead a little bit, we're going to talk about the civilizing mission, religious conversions, and nationalism. So with social Darwinism, this was a term coined in the late 19th century, and it derives its name from Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, but it applies to biological concepts like of human societies rather than social structures. Human societies and social structures rather than like animals. It not wasn't really developed by Darwin himself, but rather by others who sort of extend his ideas to social and economic realms. Herbert Spencer, in particular, was a British philosopher who developed the pseudo-scientific concept of social Darwinism. It is important to note that it is pseudo-scientific, not scientific, and it has been largely disproven. So social Darwinism was a justification for imperialism, in this idea of survival of the fittest, was the belief that in society, as in nature, only the strongest or most capable individuals survive and prosper, while the weaker ones are left behind. The claim is that it is natural for weaker societies to be imperialized or dominated by stronger ones. And in doing this, you can justify inequalities. You can look at, hey, who are you to oppose my government intervention? Because you're a lesser person. And then you also have support for imperialism and racism because of this. And this is where famously the famous poem and concept of the white man's burden to sort of civilize the lesser races. And I'm putting that in massive quotes because, again, this is a disproved pseudoscience, but this is what motivated them at the time. So you also have religious missionaries who are, in a sense, helping with imperialism. They are also bringing the cause of Jesus Christ to the nations. So cultural imperialism, part of the religious missionary movement, sought to replace local religious and cultural practices with European Christian values. Now, the civilizing mission, again, like I talked about, where many missionaries believed that they were to bring civilization to savage peoples. Again, I'm putting that in quotes. And then there's the facilitation of colonization. It established relationships that were later exploited by imperial powers for political and economic gain. Again, whether or not that was the intent of the missionary or not. And then education and westernization. Missionaries are going to bring schools and teach Western education, and groom local elites who are more sympathetic to Western ways, aiding the imperial cause. So, David Livingstone is a good example of a Scottish missionary who explored the interior of Africa. He focused on spreading Christianity and abolishing the slave trade. He helped to map the continent. Also, he fueled European interest in Africa, leading to later colonization. So, with nationalism and imperialism, these are sort of mutually reinforcing concepts. Remember, nationalism is this kind of new idea on the scene that, hey, we are one nation now. We are pushed together. We're a group of people who all sort of are pulling in the same way. Let's bring that to other places. So nationalism is going to drive imperial expansion, and nationalism is going to lead to rivalries and competition for colonies. Nationalism also supports the belief in the superiority of one's national culture, race, or system of governance, whereas imperial conquests brought wealth, which helped build the nation state and foster nationalism. So moving on to 6.2, state expansion from 1750 to 1900, what you have at this time is it's not all just state entities with colonies. You also have non-state entities, a company or organization that is not an official government or state. Examples of this: the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the Royal Niger Company, the German East Africa Company, the Imperial British East Africa Company, and the Hudson Bay Company, that was founded by the Royal Charter in 1670. It controlled large portions of North America for the fur trade, especially in what is now Canada. So if you want to remember where these things are, where they are is in the name. So with the British East India Company, we've talked so much about them. Hopefully by this point you realize how important these guys are. The EIC was initially established for trade. They created trading posts along the Indian coast. In the trading post era in India, kind of goes 1600 to 1757. So significant territorial expansion happened beyond trading post, and that begins with the Battle of Plassey in 1757. So this was fought between the EIC, the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj ud Daulah, who was allied with the French in 1757. This marked the beginning of British imperial expansion in India. The battle took place in Calcutta and ended with a decisive British victory. And this, of course, paired with the Sepoy Revolt, which we're going to talk about more here in just a minute, is going to, over the course of 100 years, give the British East India Company pretty darn direct control over India. So the EIC transitioned from being, because of the victory at the Battle of Plassey, they transitioned from being a trading organization to becoming a major political and military power in India. And the EIC installed a puppet Nawab in Bengal and collected revenue. The EIC victory also reduced French influence in India and allowed Britain to become a dominant European power there. So the EIC justified the expansion by basically saying they claimed they were bringing, hey, we're bringing stability to regions of conflict. We're replacing their inefficient their inefficient leaders. Also, the doctrine of lapse. And this policy allowed the EIC to annex any princely state where the ruler died without a direct heir. So consolidation and further expansion from 1765 to 1857, annexation of most of the Indian subcontinent through both military force and political diplomacy happened in that time. So the dissolution of the British East India Company. So with the Indian Rebellion of 1857, it was fueled by grievances against the company's rule. The EIC received reinforcements from Britain to fight the rebellion. The Government of India Act in 1858. This was when British Parliament allowed the EIC abolished the EIC and transferred territorial rights in India to the British Crown. And this was the establishment of the British Raj. India was to be governed directly now by the British government. So with imperialism in Africa, European economic interest in Africa really starts with the age of exploration, and coastal trading posts there. Remember, we talked a lot about that, especially when it came to Portugal, but also other countries too. Um, Industrializing European states in the 19th and 20th centuries sought new markets and raw materials to control. that actually began what was called the Scramble for Africa, where all of the European countries are trying to snap up as much of Africa as they possibly can. So in the 1880s to 1830s, rapid colonization and annexation of African territory by European powers took place. Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, quote, scrambled to gain more territory in Africa. And this led to the Berlin Conference in 1884. So European powers were present, but no African rulers or representatives were invited to the Berlin Conference, which was, of course, in Berlin, like I said. So they sought to regulate colonization and establish guidelines for commercial activities, also promote the civilizing mission. You'll see the map of Africa change massively from 1880 to 1913. So some major decisions from the Berlin Conference. It was the principle of effective occupation. To claim a part of Africa, a European power had to establish effective occupation of the territory, meaning they needed to have a real presence in the form of treaties, flags, or administrative and military structures. For free trade in the Congo Basin and navigation rights. This established the Congo Basin as a free trade zone and guaranteed freedom of navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers, which were important trade arteries in Africa. Also, it established some rules for future colonization. It laid down stipulations that any European power that took possession of an African coast or named themselves as a protectorate had to inform other signatory powers. And then the abolition of the slave trade. The conference declared the intention to end slavery by African and Islamic powers. So European states that expanded empires in Africa, some examples, of course, are the British and the French. In North Africa, Britain controlled Egypt while France controls Morocco. And so what you're going to see there is basically European powers are going to greatly increase their wealth and status through Africa at the detriment of African people. So the differences in imperialism between France and Britain. So for France, they aimed for cultural assimilation and direct rule. They also established a settler colony in Algeria from 1830, and then they controlled vast majorities from Mauritania to Chad as French West Africa. They also implemented the French language in legal systems. They also built infrastructures to exploit resources like oil in Algeria and peanuts in Senegal. Now, with British imperialism in Africa, they practiced more indirect rule, and they were going to leverage the local rulers there rather than doing it themselves necessarily. Again, Britain seems to be learning some lessons about the most efficient way to colonize and imperialize places. So Britain dominated trade in Nigeria and the Gold Coast. So they administered Egypt from 1882, valuing the Suez Canal's strategic importance. Good call. They also focused on resource extraction like palm oil, cotton, gold, and they encouraged English language and institutions, but preserved local customs for governance. Now, this leads to King Leopold II in the Congo Free State. He famously said, "I do not want to risk losing a fine chance to secure for ourselves a slice of this magnificent African cake." Now, King Leopold II of Belgium personally acquired the Congo Free State after the Berlin Conference. He owned it from 1885 to 1908. He made a fortune extracting rubber with forced Congolese labor, and millions died under his rule. So he is sort of the worst example of this sort of terrible treatment of the Africans. And I mean, you really see it with King Leopold II, and he is an important guy to remember when you're talking about the treatment, and maybe even as we look forward, why places tended to resist. And this is a big guy to remember. So the Congo Free State is going to be a really, really important thing to remember because of King Leopold. It's one of the most egregious examples. It's one of the most egregious examples of colonial exploitation in history. The Force Publique, which was a mercenary military force that oppressed the local population. Forced labor in the rubber industry, of course, happens. Impossible quotas came with severe punishments, including mutilation. Millions died, the environment was damaged, and there was a widespread international outcry about the treatment of the people in the Congo. So settler colonies, just an example, a type of colony where the colonizing country sends a significant number of its nationals to inhabit the land and maintain political control over it. Example of this might be French Algeria or New Zealand, which was a settler colony of Britain, also Australia. Now, moving really quick to the Empire of Japan. Japan, at this point, is putting on its big boy imperial pants. They fought Russia from 1904 to 1905 over Russia's lease of the Liaodong. And the Liaodong Peninsula and the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway through Manchuria in China, because those were all threats to Japan. Now, victory for Japan resulted in their control of the Liaodong Peninsula, the South Manchuria Railway, and the southern half of the Sakhalin Island. But what it does really is it announces to the rest of the world, hey, this is a real Asian power, and you really will have to contend with them. And they're the only Asian power that has that sort of clout on the world stage. Now, Russia also had some imperial pursuits in this time, a number of them. And I mean, Russia is huge, and you're going to see that they really try to step onto the big boy stage here as well. Now, America, they purchased Alaska in this time. They don't initially involve any large scale settlement or direct economic exploitation, motivated more by strategic concerns. So buying the Alaskan purchase means that now they have a non-contiguous, it's not connected expansion. Also, this is consistent with the broader ideology of manifest destiny, which was the 19th century belief in the United States that it was destined and maybe even divinely ordained to expand territory and influence across the entire North American continent. So you're going to see this in the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, where the U.S. acquires California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of California, Wyoming, New Mexico, Texas. Also, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, where America doubles its size, and then also in the annexation of Texas. So I know this was a lot, but this is the way that people justified the imperialism of other places.